It was a quiet afternoon in a small cafe on the edge of the city. The air was filled with the soft hum of conversations, the smell of roasted coffee beans, and the faint music playing from a small speaker behind the counter. The place had a warm charm, with sunlight spilling through large windows and touching the old wooden furniture that seemed to have its own history. In the corner stood an upright piano, a little worn but still beautiful, as if it had witnessed countless stories. It had been sitting there for years, more as decoration than as an instrument. Few ever touched it anymore. That afternoon, a young woman sat at one of the corner tables, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She looked calm, but there was something quiet and distant in her eyes, something that spoke of memories she didn't often share. Her hair was slightly messy, as though she hadn't cared much to fix it that morning. Her clothes were simple, a faded sweater and jeans, but there was something graceful about the way she sat, watching the world go by through the window. Every now and then her gaze drifted toward the old piano. She would look at it for a moment and then turn away, almost as if she were afraid of it. The cafe owner, a kind older man with a friendly smile, noticed her glancing at the piano again and again. He'd seen her come in several times over the past few weeks. She always sat in the same spot, always alone, always quiet. This time curiosity got the better of him. He walked over to her table with a smile and said, "You keep looking at that piano. Do you play?" She looked up, startled. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then she gave a small smile and shook her head slightly. "I used to," she said softly. "A long time ago," the cafe owner chuckled. "Well, it still works, you know. Maybe you could play us something simple. It would be nice to hear it again. It's been quiet for too long." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She looked at the piano again, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I don't know," she said. "It's been years. I might have forgotten." A few customers nearby overheard the conversation and began encouraging her gently. One woman said, "Come on, just one tune. It'll brighten up the afternoon." Another added, "We won't judge. Just something small." The woman looked around. People were smiling at her, expecting something innocent and light. She felt her heart beating faster. A part of her wanted to refuse and stay in the comfort of silence. But another part, the one that had long been asleep, wanted to feel those keys again. She finally smiled a little, set her cup down, and stood up slowly. The cafe went quiet as she walked toward the piano. The sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor seemed louder than usual. She reached out and brushed her fingers across the surface of the piano, feeling the dust and the faint roughness of old varnish. She lifted the fallboard gently, revealing the keys, some slightly chipped, a few discolored, but still beautiful. She pressed one key softly. It gave out a low, hesitant note that lingered for a second before fading. She sat down on the small bench, took a deep breath, and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers felt stiff at first. The piano felt heavier than she remembered. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to recall how it used to feel when she played as a child. Back then, her small hands could barely reach the full octave, yet she never cared. She played for hours, lost in her own world. The music had been her escape, a way to forget the noise of the world, to forget the worries that surrounded her home. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and tired, calling her to dinner while she practiced scales late into the evening. She remembered the laughter of her younger brother, who would sit beside her on the bench and hit random keys just to make her smile. But those days were gone. Life had changed, and with it her music had faded away. As she sat there now, the cafe waiting in silence, she felt a mix of fear and longing. Her hands trembled slightly. The cafe owner gave her an encouraging nod. "Just something simple," he said gently. She nodded almost to herself and pressed the first few notes of a familiar melody, something she used to play when she was younger. The sound came out uneven at first, her fingers unsure, the rhythm shaky. But as she continued, something began to shift. The stiffness in her hands eased. The music began to flow more naturally. The melody grew softer, warmer. People who had been talking quietly stopped mid-sentence and turned their heads toward her. Even the sound of the coffee machine behind the counter seemed to fade. There was something about the way she played, gentle but full of feeling, that drew everyone in. As the tune continued, her posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her fingers began to move with confidence. It was as though each note unlocked something inside her. The melody that had started as a simple tune now carried emotion, sorrow, joy, nostalgia, all mixed into one. The woman was no longer just playing. She was remembering. She remembered the night she gave up music. Her father had lost his job and her family needed her to help. She found work at a small store and told herself it was only temporary, that she'd return to music one day. But one day became 1 year and then several. The piano in her home gathered dust and eventually it was sold to pay for bills. The sound that once filled her evenings disappeared from her life completely. And yet, even now, after all these years, her fingers remembered. Her heart remembered. The music came back as if it had been waiting for her all along. Each note seemed to carry a story. Each chord felt like a whisper from her past. The cafe was silent except for the sound of her playing. A couple sitting near the window held hands as they listened. A child stopped drawing and stared wide-eyed. The cafe owner leaned on the counter, smiling softly, his eyes glistening. As she reached the end of the tune, she slowed down, letting the final notes fade gently into the air. The silence that followed was heavy yet peaceful. For a few seconds, no one moved or spoke. Then a single clap broke the silence, followed by another, and then the whole room filled with applause. The woman turned around, startled by the reaction. Her cheeks flushed as she gave a shy smile. She hadn't expected anyone to listen so intently, let alone applaud. The cafe owner came closer and said, "That wasn't simple. That was beautiful." She lowered her eyes, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't think I could still play." He smiled kindly. "Some things never really leave us. They just wait for the right moment to return." She nodded, touched by his words. The customers began talking again, but the atmosphere was different now. There was a softness in the air, a shared warmth that came from the unexpected gift she had given them. She went back to her table, her tea now cold, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. As she sat down, she looked at her hands, still slightly trembling from the performance. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the sound of the notes filling the room, it all felt like a dream. She realized she had missed it deeply, more than she had ever allowed herself to admit. Outside, the sun had started to set, casting a golden glow through the windows. The cafe owner placed a fresh cup of tea on her table without saying a word. She smiled in gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace. As the evening went on, a few people came up to her, complimenting her playing and asking if she had ever performed professionally. She shook her head, embarrassed, and said softly, "No, it was just something I used to love." One of them replied, "You should never have stopped." Her smile faded for a moment as she thought about it. Life had demanded so much from her that she'd forgotten how to give something back to herself. Maybe this was the universe's way of reminding her. When she left the cafe that night, the city lights shimmered around her. She walked slowly, the sound of her footsteps mixing with the faint echoes of the melodies she had played. She could still feel the piano beneath her hands, still hear the applause, still see the smiles of those who had listened. Something inside her had shifted. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the piano. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a part of her story, a part she had buried under years of responsibility and silence. And now that part had come back to life. She knew that tomorrow she would return to the cafe, not just to drink tea, but to sit by that piano again. The music that had once been lost had found its way back to her, gently, quietly, just like the woman she had become. And in that small cafe, surrounded by strangers who had unknowingly witnessed her rebirth, she rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever, the sound of her own heart speaking through the keys. The next morning, the woman woke up earlier than usual. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to the faint sound of the city outside her window. The world seemed calmer than it had in a long time. For years, her mornings had been filled with rushing, getting ready for work, catching the bus, and spending the day at a job that barely paid her bills. But today felt different. Something inside her had changed. The music she played at the cafe the day before was still echoing in her mind. Every note seemed to linger in her heart like a soft whisper reminding her of something she had forgotten long ago. She got up and went to make tea. As the kettle boiled, her eyes fell on her old hands, the same ones that had touched the piano keys. Yesterday, her fingers were still a little sore, but there was a kind of warmth in that feeling. It made her smile quietly to herself. For the first time in years, she felt alive. At work, her co-workers noticed the change. She worked at a small shop that sold books and stationery, a place filled with quiet corners and the soft sound of paper. Usually she kept to herself, doing her tasks silently. But that day she seemed different, lighter, calmer. One of her co-workers asked if something good had happened. She laughed softly and said, "I just played the piano again after a long time." Her co-worker looked surprised. "You play?" "I used to," she said, and for a moment her voice carried both pride and sadness. "Yesterday the cafe owner asked me to play something simple and I did. I didn't expect to feel so much." "That's wonderful," the co-worker said kindly. "You should do it more often. You looked happier just talking about it." The words stayed with her all day. She hadn't realized how much she had missed happiness until someone else pointed it out. Every time she had thought about the piano before, it had brought pain, reminders of dreams lost and a future that never happened. But now thinking of it filled her with warmth. When her shift ended, she walked past the cafe again. The lights inside were glowing softly, and she could see the same piano sitting quietly in the corner. The cafe owner was behind the counter, busy serving a group of students. She stood outside for a moment, watching through the glass. The piano almost seemed to call her. She walked in, and the cafe owner looked up with a smile. "You're back," he said cheerfully. "People are still talking about your playing from yesterday." She blushed slightly. "Really?" he nodded. "You made quite an impression. Some of the customers even asked when you'd play again." She smiled, shy but touched. "I didn't plan to," she said softly. "I just wanted to stop by." "Well," the owner said, wiping his hands on a towel, "you're always welcome to play if you feel like it. The piano has missed music for years." She looked at the piano again. Her heart raced a little, but this time it wasn't fear. It was excitement. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe just for a few minutes. A few customers noticed her walking toward the piano and whispered softly. She sat down on the same bench, took a deep breath, and started to play a different melody. One she used to play when she was younger, a song her mother used to hum while cooking. The tune was gentle and filled with warmth. Her fingers moved more easily now, flowing naturally across the keys. The cafe filled with sound again, and the atmosphere changed. The music seemed to wrap around everyone in the room. People stopped what they were doing, some smiling, some closing their eyes as they listened. It wasn't just the melody, it was the feeling behind it. It was pure, honest, and full of heart. As she played, memories began to surface again, clearer this time. She could see herself as a child, sitting at the piano in her small living room. Her mother would sit beside her, sometimes humming softly, sometimes just listening with a smile. She remembered the way sunlight used to fall through the window onto the piano keys. That house had been small, but it had always been filled with love and laughter. Music had been the heart of it all. Then her thoughts turned to the day it all changed. Her mother had fallen sick and everything became uncertain. The sound of music had been replaced by the sound of worry, whispers about hospital bills, jobs, and survival. She had promised her mother that she would take care of the family no matter what, and she did. But in doing so, she gave up her music. Now as she played in that cafe, she could almost feel her mother's presence beside her again, as if those lost years had folded into this one moment. She smiled softly through the tears that formed in her eyes. When the last note faded, the cafe was silent once more. Then a gentle wave of applause filled the air. People clapped with genuine warmth, their faces glowing with appreciation. The cafe owner walked over and said quietly, "You have a gift. You shouldn't hide it." She shook her head, still smiling through the emotion. "I don't know if it's a gift anymore," she said. "It feels like I'm just remembering who I was." "Maybe that's exactly what gifts are for," he said kindly. "To help us remember who we are." She looked around the cafe. The people who had been strangers just a few days ago were now smiling at her as if they knew her story. She felt connected, to them, to herself, and to something bigger than her worries. Over the next few days, she began visiting the cafe more often. Sometimes she would play. Sometimes she would just sit quietly and listen to others talking around her. Each visit brought her closer to herself. Music became her way of breathing again. One evening, as she finished playing, a man approached her. He was older, with gray hair and a kind face. "You play beautifully," he said. "Have you ever performed professionally?" She smiled modestly. "No, I never had the chance," he nodded thoughtfully. "I used to teach music at the community center nearby. "We're starting a small music program for children who can't afford lessons. Would you ever consider helping out?" She froze for a moment. The idea of teaching music felt unreal. She had never imagined being in that position again. "I'm not sure," she said softly. "It's been such a long time," the man smiled. "It doesn't matter how long it's been. What matters is that you still have the heart for it. And from what I heard, you do." That night, she thought about his words. She remembered how it felt when she was young, dreaming of teaching others to love music the way she did. She had let go of that dream for survival, but now it was knocking again, asking to be let back in. The next day, she visited the community center. It was a modest building filled with children laughing and playing. The music teacher greeted her warmly and showed her the small room where they held lessons. There was an old keyboard in the corner, missing a few keys but still functional. She sat down and pressed a few notes. The sound was imperfect, but she smiled anyway. When the first group of children came in, they looked at her curiously. Some were shy, others full of energy. She introduced herself simply, telling them she was there to help them learn to play. At first, she was nervous, but as the children began to press the keys, giggling at the sounds they made, she felt something inside her open up again. Teaching them brought her joy she hadn't felt in years. Watching their small hands fumble over the notes reminded her of her own early days. Every mistake they made was followed by laughter, and every small success felt like a victory. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself balancing her job and her music lessons. Each day she felt a little more alive. The cafe became her sanctuary, and the community center became her purpose. One evening, as she walked home after class, she saw the city lights shimmering on the wet pavement. The world around her looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She realized that music wasn't something she had lost. It had simply been waiting for her to return. At the cafe, people still asked her to play. Each time she did, the crowd listened quietly, moved not just by the melody, but by the feeling behind it. She never told them her whole story, but they didn't need to hear it. They could feel it in the way she played. The cafe owner sometimes joked that his place had turned into a small concert hall, and she would laugh softly. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about applause or attention. It was about finding her voice again. Sometimes, when she finished playing, she would look out the window and see people walking by, lost in their own thoughts. She wondered how many of them had something they loved but had given up. She hoped that maybe, in hearing her play, someone would remember their own forgotten dream. Late at night, when she was alone, she often sat quietly thinking about everything that had happened. She still had bills to pay and struggles to face, but those things no longer defined her. What defined her now was the way her fingers danced over the keys, the way her heart lifted every time she played. Music had once been her dream, then her loss, and now it had become her healing. She didn't know where it would lead her next, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of the future. She just felt grateful. To the cafe owner who had asked her to play a simple tune, to the people who had listened, and to herself for having the courage to begin again. And as she closed her eyes that night, the memory of the piano followed her into her dreams, not as a reminder of what she lost, but as a promise of what she had found again. The following week felt like something out of a dream. The woman's life, once filled with quiet routines and dull hours, now had music running through it again. Each day after work, she found herself stopping by the cafe. It had become her favorite place, not because of the coffee or the cozy chairs, but because of that old piano sitting in the corner. Every time she saw it, her heart felt warm, as if it were greeting her like an old friend. The cafe owner would smile whenever she walked in. He didn't even have to ask anymore. He would just nod toward the piano and she would smile back, taking her usual seat on the worn-out bench. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the noise of the world outside disappeared. The music became her way of speaking, something she hadn't realized she needed so badly. The regular customers had started to notice her too. Some came earlier just to listen, while others stayed longer when they saw her sit down. It wasn't that she played like a famous pianist, but there was something honest and pure about her music that made people feel something deep inside. The tunes were filled with memories, small joys, and quiet sadness. One afternoon, as she finished playing a soft melody, an elderly woman approached her. She was holding a small cup of tea and had kind eyes that seemed to understand without words. Your music, the woman said gently, reminds me of my daughter. She used to play like that before she moved away. Listening to you feels like hearing her again. The pianist smiled shyly. Thank you, she said softly. I'm glad it made you feel something. The old woman nodded and said, You have a gift, dear. You should never stop using it. Then she walked away slowly, leaving the woman sitting there with a warmth spreading through her heart. That evening, after leaving the cafe, she thought about what the woman had said. She realized how much her music had started to mean to people, not just to herself. It was strange in a way. She had once believed that her life had passed that dream by, that she had missed her chance. But now, even though she wasn't on a stage or in a concert hall, her music was touching hearts again, one small cafe at a time. The next few days at the shop passed quickly. Work still wasn't exciting, but she didn't mind as much anymore. She found herself humming while arranging the books or writing down sales. Her co-workers noticed her cheerful mood and often teased her playfully about becoming famous at the cafe. She laughed it off, but deep down the idea made her blush. Every evening she taught children at the community center. It had become something she looked forward to just as much as playing at the cafe. The children were full of energy and curiosity, their small hands learning to form chords and simple tunes. They often asked her to play something beautiful for them at the end of each lesson, and she always did. Their faces lit up as they listened, their eyes full of wonder. One day after class, a little boy came up to her and said, When I grow up, I want to play just like you. His innocent smile melted her heart. She knelt down and said, You can and you will. Just don't stop loving music no matter what happens. That night she walked home with a quiet smile. The world around her seemed softer, more alive. She noticed things she had ignored for years, the way the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, the sound of laughter from people passing by, the wind rustling through the trees. Everything seemed to have a rhythm, a song of its own. One weekend, the cafe owner approached her with an idea. You know, he said, wiping a cup behind the counter, people keep asking when you're going to play again. I was thinking maybe we could host a small music night here. Nothing big, just a cozy evening where people can enjoy your piano and maybe some live singing. What do you think? She was surprised. Me? Play for a whole night? He smiled. Why not? You've already been filling this place with music. Let's make it official. She hesitated. The thought of performing in front of a crowd made her nervous. It wasn't like the small moments when she played quietly for whoever happened to be there. A music night meant everyone would come specifically to listen to her, but the cafe owner's encouragement was warm and sincere. After thinking for a moment, she said softly, All right, let's try. The next few days were a mix of excitement and fear. She practiced at the cafe whenever she could. The cafe owner helped her choose songs, some light and cheerful, others emotional and deep. He also made small posters announcing the event. Live Piano Night, an evening of heartfelt music. When she saw her name printed on the flyer, she felt a strange flutter in her chest. It had been so long since she had seen her name connected to music. It made her nervous but also proud. The night of the event came faster than she expected. The cafe was filled with people, regular customers, her co-workers, some of the children's parents from the community center, and even strangers who had heard about it. The place was warm and full of energy, yet she could feel her hands shaking slightly as she sat at the piano. The cafe owner gave her a reassuring nod. Just play like you always do, he whispered. From the heart, she took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes were soft and hesitant, but as she continued, her nerves faded away. The music took over. She played pieces she loved, each one holding a piece of her life, the joy, the sadness, the struggle, and the quiet hope that had brought her to this moment. The audience was silent, completely absorbed. Some closed their eyes. Others smiled as if remembering something from their own lives. When she finished her first song, the applause filled the cafe. Her eyes shimmered with emotion, but she didn't stop. She moved on to the next piece, then another. Halfway through, she played a tune she had written herself, a soft, flowing melody that spoke of rediscovery. As her fingers danced over the keys, she thought of the people who had supported her. The cafe owner, the old woman, the children, even the strangers who smiled at her music. It felt as if all their kindness had gathered in her fingertips, guiding her through every note. When the final song ended, she lifted her hands slowly from the piano. The silence that followed was deep, the kind that holds meaning. Then the room erupted in applause. People stood clapping and cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. She looked up, stunned by their reaction, and felt a lump rise in her throat. The cafe owner came over, smiling proudly. "You see," he said softly. "I told you people needed your music." She could barely speak, but she nodded, whispering, "Thank you." After the show, people came up to talk to her, thanking her for the evening and telling her how her music made them feel. Some said it reminded them of someone they loved. Others said it made them feel peace after a long week. Hearing their words filled her heart in a way she couldn't explain. Later, when most of the crowd had gone and the cafe was quiet again, she sat alone by the piano. Her fingers traced the keys softly, not playing but just feeling them. The cafe owner brought her a cup of warm tea and said, "You did something special tonight. You brought people together." She smiled, tired but happy. "I just played what I felt. That's exactly why it worked," he said. "You played with your heart, not for attention." She looked around the empty cafe, the chairs slightly out of place, the soft hum of the light still on, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. For so long she had believed that her story with music was over, but life had found a way to bring it back, not through fame or big stages, but through small moments of truth. When she finally left the cafe that night, the streets were quiet. The moon hung low in the sky and the cool air brushed her face. She walked slowly, feeling the peace that only comes after doing something that truly matters. She thought about how close she had come to never playing again, how easily her music could have been lost forever. But fate had other plans. One small invitation to play a simple tune had changed everything. It had led her back to her passion, her purpose, and her sense of self. As she reached her home and looked up at the sky, she whispered softly, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for giving her another chance." That night she couldn't sleep for a long time. She lay awake, her mind replaying the evening, the faces in the crowd, the sound of applause, the feeling of the keys under her fingers. She realized something important. Music wasn't just something she did. It was who she was. It had always been there, waiting patiently for her to find it again. And now that she had, she wasn't going to let it go. The days after the cafe performance felt like a soft dream that refused to fade. Every morning the woman woke up feeling lighter, as if a quiet joy had taken root inside her. The sound of applause from that night still echoed in her heart. It wasn't about being praised or admired. It was about being seen, being heard after years of silence. She had spent so long believing her music was gone, but now it had come back stronger, deeper, and filled with meaning. The cafe owner had been right. The event changed everything. People started visiting the cafe more often, not just for the food or drinks, but for the atmosphere that her music had created. The old piano was no longer just decoration. It had become the soul of the place. On weekends, the cafe was filled with the gentle sound of her playing. People would sip their coffee, talk quietly, or simply close their eyes to listen. Some brought flowers or small notes thanking her for the peace her music gave them. One evening, as she finished playing a soft tune, the cafe owner came over with a warm smile. "You've given this place life again," he said. "Everyone comes here because of you now." She smiled modestly and replied, "I think they come for the feeling, not for me. Music makes people remember something kind in themselves." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe so, but you're the one reminding them to feel it." After closing that night, she helped him clean up, folding napkins and wiping tables. She didn't mind helping. The cafe had become like a second home. Before leaving, she turned to the piano one last time, pressing a single note that lingered softly in the air. It felt like a good-night whisper. The next morning, while she was at work, something unexpected happened. A man walked into the bookshop where she worked. He looked about middle-aged, carrying a camera bag and a notepad. He greeted her politely and asked if she was the one who played at the cafe down the street. Surprised, she nodded slowly. "Yes, I do sometimes," she said. He smiled. "I'm writing a small piece for a local magazine. People have been talking about your piano evenings. I was wondering if I could interview you, just a small story about how it all began." Her first reaction was hesitation. She wasn't used to attention. and the idea of her story being published felt strange. "I don't know if there's much to tell," she said quietly. "I just played when someone asked me to." "That's exactly what makes it interesting," the man replied kindly. "It's not about fame. It's about moments that make life beautiful, and your story seems to be one of them." After a pause, she agreed. They sat at a small table in the corner of the shop while he asked her questions about her life, her love for music, and how she had stopped playing for years. She spoke simply, honestly, without trying to sound special. She told him about how the piano had once been her world, how life's struggles had pushed her away from it, and how one quiet afternoon in a cafe had brought it all back. When the article was published a week later, she didn't expect much. But people began to notice. Strangers came to the cafe holding the magazine in their hands, wanting to hear her play. Some even waited outside before opening time. The cafe, once a quiet little corner of the neighborhood, became a place filled with stories and emotion. But the woman didn't let it change her. She still played with the same simplicity, the same honesty. She wasn't performing for recognition. Every note she played still came from her heart, from the part of her that had once been lost and was now alive again. One evening, after the crowd had left, the cafe owner handed her a letter someone had dropped off earlier. It was folded neatly, written in an old-fashioned style. She opened it and read, "Your music reminded me of my late wife. She used to play the same melodies when we were young. Listening to you felt like she was beside me again, even if just for a few minutes. Thank you for giving me that moment." Her eyes filled with tears as she read. She held the letter close for a long while. That simple note reminded her why she played. Not for applause, not for attention, but for connection. Music was her way of reaching hearts she might never meet. In the weeks that followed, her routine continued. Work in the morning, teaching children in the afternoon, and playing at the cafe in the evenings. Each day felt full and meaningful. The children she taught were improving quickly. Some of them could now play small tunes on their own. They often begged her to perform for them, and she always agreed, laughing at their excitement. One day, a little girl brought her a small bunch of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. "This is for you," the girl said shyly. "You make everyone happy when you play." The woman smiled and hugged her gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means." She placed the flowers in a small glass jar and brought them to the cafe that evening, setting them on top of the piano. They stayed there for days, reminding her that kindness always finds its way back, but not everything was perfect. One rainy night, while she was playing a slow tune, a man at one of the tables interrupted her. He looked frustrated, his voice loud. "Play something faster. Something cheerful." "This is too sad." The cafe grew quiet. The woman looked up, startled. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. But then she smiled calmly and said, "Every song has its own kind of feeling. Sometimes sadness reminds us we're still alive." The man fell silent, looking embarrassed. After a moment, he muttered an apology. She nodded softly and continued playing. The room, once tense, filled again with peace. When she finished, the crowd clapped warmly, not just for the music, but for her grace. Later that night, the cafe owner said, "You handled that beautifully. You have a strength you probably don't even see in yourself." She smiled quietly. Music teaches patience. It teaches you to listen, even when others don't understand. As the weeks passed, her music reached more people. The cafe owner started receiving calls from nearby restaurants and community centers, asking if she would be willing to perform for their events. Each time she hesitated, crowds still made her nervous, but deep down, she knew these invitations were a chance to share what had once been lost. Finally, she agreed to play at a charity event for the community center where she taught. The night of the event, she arrived early, dressed simply but elegantly. The small hall was decorated with soft lights and handmade paper lanterns created by the children. Parents, neighbors, and even strangers filled the seats. When it was her turn to play, she took a deep breath and walked to the stage. The room went quiet as she sat at the piano. For a moment, she closed her eyes and remembered the little girl with the flowers, the old man's letter, the cafe filled with warmth, and the day she first touched the piano again after years of silence. Then she began to play. The melody flowed like water, gentle, deep, full of emotion. It spoke of pain and healing, of time lost and rediscovered joy. The crowd listened silently, many with tears in their eyes. When she finished, the room erupted in applause and several people stood to their feet. The children she taught clapped the loudest, their faces glowing with pride. Afterward, the event organizer thanked her for her performance. "You don't just play music," he said. "You remind people that there's still beauty in small things." On her way home that night, she walked slowly, the cool air brushing against her skin. She looked up at the stars and smiled. Life had not been easy for her. There had been years of struggle, silence, and loneliness. But somehow all those moments had led her here, to this simple, meaningful happiness. She thought about how music had found her again when she least expected it. How a small invitation at a cafe had turned into a new beginning. How strangers had become friends and how her heart had learned to trust life again. When she reached her home, she sat by the window, her hands resting on her lap. Outside, the rain had stopped and the world seemed washed clean. She closed her eyes, hearing the faint echo of her own piano playing in her mind. She knew now that no matter what happened next, she would never let the silence take over again. Her story wasn't about fame or success. It was about rediscovery. It was about the quiet power of doing what you love, even when no one is watching. It was about how something as simple as a melody could connect people, heal wounds, and make the world a little softer. Before going to bed, she whispered to herself, "Thank you for giving me music again." And as she drifted to sleep, a peaceful smile touched her lips, knowing that tomorrow and every day after, she would continue to play, not for the world, but for her soul. It had been a few months since that charity performance, but the feeling of that night still stayed with her like a quiet flame that wouldn't fade. The letters, the smiles, the applause, they were things she never expected to receive again. Life had given her something rare, something gentle, something she thought she had lost forever. Each day now carried a sense of meaning. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was her way of talking to the world without saying a word. She continued to play at the cafe, and the little place had become a warm corner where people came not just for food or drink, but for peace. Sometimes she would look up while playing and see people smiling softly or even wiping their eyes. There was something special about those moments. It wasn't sadness or joy alone. It was something deeper, something human. One afternoon, while she was helping a student with a piano lesson at the community center, the cafe owner came by with a newspaper in his hand. He looked excited. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "You've been mentioned again. This time in the city paper." She blinked in surprise. "In the city paper?" "Why?" He smiled. "Someone must have attended the charity event and written about it. They called you the woman who plays with her heart." She laughed softly, embarrassed. "That's too much," she said, shaking her head. "I only play what I feel." "That's exactly why people listen," he said. "They feel it too." Later that evening, when she got home, she found a message slipped under her door. It was written on thick paper with neat handwriting. It said that a local concert organizer had seen her play and wanted to invite her to a small community concert in the city. The letter ended with, "We believe your story and your music deserve a wider audience." She sat down for a long time holding the letter. The thought of performing in front of a larger crowd both thrilled and frightened her. She wasn't sure she was ready for something like that. It had taken her years to play in front of a few dozen people. Now they were asking her to play for hundreds. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about how far she had come. A year ago she had been living quietly, avoiding anything that reminded her of the past. Now life kept opening new doors for her. She thought about refusing, telling herself she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But deep inside she knew this was another moment that could change everything. The next morning she walked to the cafe early. The owner was already there, setting up chairs. She told him about the invitation. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "I think you should go. You don't owe anyone a performance, but you owe yourself a chance to see how far you can go. This could be the next chapter for you." She nodded slowly. "I'm scared," she admitted. He smiled kindly. "Then play through the fear. That's how you've always done it." So she agreed. The following weeks were filled with preparation. She practiced every evening after work, going over each piece until it felt like breathing. She didn't aim for perfection. She aimed for truth. She chose songs that told stories of hope, loss, finding courage again. When she played, she wanted people to feel what words could never say. As the concert day approached, she began to feel nervous again. She worried she wouldn't belong among the other performers, most of whom were trained professionals. But she reminded herself that music wasn't a competition. It was a conversation. She would simply speak in her own way. On the evening of the concert, she arrived at the small city hall where the event was held. The stage lights looked brighter than she remembered, and the hall was already filling with people. The noise, the movement, the sound of tuning instruments, it all made her heart race. She sat quietly backstage, her hands resting in her lap. She looked down at them, these same hands that had once been too tired to touch a piano, now ready to share something honest with so many. When it was finally her turn, she walked onto the stage slowly. The audience quieted as she sat at the piano. For a moment she closed her eyes. The noise of the world faded away and only the silence remained. Then she began to play. The first notes floated softly through the hall, tender, calm, filled with something that words could never describe. The melody rose and fell like the rhythm of breathing. She poured her heart into every sound, all the years of silence, struggle, and rediscovery. As she played, she saw faces in the audience soften, eyes glisten, hands clasped together. When the final note lingered in the air, the room was utterly still. Then came the applause, gentle at first, then rising like a wave. People stood to their feet. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. She stood slowly and bowed, her heart full. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt free. After the performance, several people came up to her. One young woman said, "I used to play the piano, but I gave it up. Watching you tonight made me want to start again." An elderly man added softly, "Your music reminded me that time doesn't take away beauty. It just changes how we see it." She smiled and thanked them, humbled. She didn't know how to respond to such kindness. A few days later, she received another letter, this one from a small music academy. They had read about her and wanted her to visit and speak to students about her journey. The thought made her nervous again, but she accepted. When she arrived at the academy, she was welcomed by a room full of young students, eager and bright. The head instructor introduced her warmly and invited her to speak. She stood before them, feeling their curious eyes on her. "I'm not a professional musician," she began. "I'm someone who loved music so much that even when life took it away, it found a way back to me." She paused, looking at the piano in the room. "What I've learned is that talent is not what keeps music alive. Love does. When you love something, it becomes part of you. It waits quietly until you're ready again." The students listened carefully, some nodding, others smiling softly. She ended by playing a short tune for them, something soft and full of hope. When she finished, the room was quiet before breaking into applause. That day stayed in her heart. She realized she had become not just a performer, but someone who could inspire others. It wasn't about fame. It was about giving people courage through something as simple as sound. Months passed. Her life was still simple, work, teaching, the cafe, but it felt fuller than ever. Sometimes as she played, she would remember the first time she sat at that cafe piano, hesitant and unsure. Now everything had changed because of that one small moment of courage. One night, as she was finishing her set at the cafe, she noticed a man sitting near the window. He looked familiar, and when she finished playing, he stood and approached her. "I'm the journalist who first wrote your story," he said with a smile. "It's good to see you're still playing." She smiled warmly. "Thank you," she said. "That article changed more than you know." He nodded. "It changed things for me, too. I started writing about real people again. Not just headlines, stories that remind us what matters." They talked for a while, sharing memories of that first interview, and before leaving, he said, "You've reminded so many people that it's never too late to begin again. Don't ever stop." That night, as she locked the cafe door and stepped out into the cool air, she stood under the streetlight for a moment. The city was quiet and the stars were scattered across the sky. She closed her eyes and listened to the faint sound of her own heart, steady and calm. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, but she also knew she would keep playing. Because for her, music was not just sound. It was memory, emotion, and life itself. As she walked home, the moonlight followed her path, soft and steady. And in that silence, she whispered a small promise to herself, to never let fear steal what love had given back. Her journey was far from over. It was only unfolding note by note like a melody that refused to end. And somewhere deep inside her she felt a quiet certainty that as long as she kept playing, her music would keep reaching hearts that needed it, one soft song at a time. The days that followed felt softer than she ever remembered. The city around her had grown louder, busier, but inside she felt calm. Her routine had become familiar again, but not in the dull way it once was. Now every morning carried a kind of quiet excitement. She would wake before sunrise, make a cup of tea, and sit by the window, letting the early light fall on her hands. Sometimes her fingers moved slightly on the table as if an invisible piano rested there. It had become a habit. The music never truly left her even when the piano was silent. At the cafe, things had changed too. The once small place had turned into a beloved part of the neighborhood. People often stopped by, not just for the coffee or pastries, but to hear her play. Sometimes they brought friends or family, telling them, "You have to listen to her, she plays like she's telling a story." It became a kind of tradition. And though more people knew her name now, she stayed humble, smiling shyly when someone asked for a photo or a handshake. But even as life seemed peaceful, she sometimes found herself thinking quietly about how everything had happened. It all began with one small request, one simple invitation to play a tune. That moment had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. It reminded her how fragile and beautiful life could be, how something as simple as saying yes could open a door to a new beginning. One morning, while she was cleaning the cafe piano before opening time, a woman walked in. She looked around nervously and approached the counter. She held a folded newspaper in her hand. When she saw the pianist, she smiled softly. "Are you the one who plays here?" The pianist nodded gently. "Yes, I am. Would you like a drink?" "We're about to open." The woman shook her head. "No, thank you. I came because I read about you in the paper. My daughter used to play piano before she got sick." She stopped because she said music made her sad. But then she saw a video of you playing and now she wants to learn again. The pianist froze for a moment. Her throat tightened. "That's very kind of her," she said softly. "She asked me to give you this," the woman continued, handing over a small drawing. It was a simple picture, a piano surrounded by flowers, and in the middle a small girl sitting at it with a big smile. Underneath, the girl had written, "Thank you for helping me love music again." The pianist stared at it for a long time, her heart swelling with emotion. "Please tell her I said thank you," she whispered. "Tell her to never stop playing." The woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "I will." After she left, the pianist sat at the piano and looked at the drawing again. She placed it gently under the glass cover on top of the piano, where everyone could see it. From that day forward, it stayed there, a small reminder that music could heal more than just one person. Weeks turned into months, and her life slowly became a rhythm of small, beautiful moments. The cafe was always full of people. Her students were improving, and she even started writing her own melodies, soft, flowing pieces that came from her memories. Sometimes she wrote them late at night when the world outside was quiet, and only the ticking of the clock kept her company. She didn't write for fame or recognition. She wrote because it was how she spoke to life. One afternoon, the cafe owner told her something unexpected. "There's a small festival next month," he said. "They want local musicians to perform. I think you should go," she smiled faintly. "A festival? That sounds big." "It's not that big," he said with a grin. "But it's outside by the river. People bring blankets, children run around, there are lights everywhere. It's peaceful. It feels like something you'd love." She hesitated at first, but he was right. Something about it sounded comforting. So she agreed. The day of the festival came, and the evening air was cool and sweet. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. She arrived early, carrying her small music notebook and a quiet smile. The organizers welcomed her warmly and guided her to the small wooden stage set near the water. Lights hung above, swaying gently with the breeze. Families were sitting on picnic blankets. Couples were holding hands, and children were chasing bubbles that floated through the air. It was simple, happy, and real. When her turn came, she sat at the piano placed under a canopy of lights. The soft murmur of the crowd faded as she took a breath. She looked up at the river for a moment, watching how it caught the light, how it moved without stopping. And then she began to play. The melody was new, something she had written just a few days before. It was tender, almost like a whisper. It spoke of the things she had lived, the loneliness, the rediscovery, the kindness she had met along the way. The notes floated through the night air, gentle but strong, finding their way to every corner of the crowd. People fell silent. Some closed their eyes. Others smiled softly. Even the children grew still, drawn to the sound. It was as if the whole world had paused for that one moment to listen. When the last note faded into the air, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. The crowd stayed silent for a few seconds, then erupted into applause that echoed across the river. Someone shouted, "Play another!" and laughter spread through the crowd. She smiled shyly, nodding, and began another gentle tune, this one more playful, full of light. After the performance, people came up to her with warm words and smiles. A young boy handed her a small flower he had picked from the grass. "That song made my mom cry," he said proudly. She bent down and smiled. Then maybe it helped her heart remember something beautiful. He nodded, not fully understanding, but smiled anyway before running back to his mother. Later that night, as the festival ended, she stood near the river, watching the lights reflect on the water. The cafe owner came up beside her. "You know," he said, "you've done something very special. You've given people hope. You've made them feel something real." She looked out at the water. "I just played," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, you shared yourself. That's rarer." She didn't respond, but his words stayed with her long after the festival lights went out. In the following days, life returned to its gentle rhythm, but she noticed something different. She felt more at peace than ever before. She no longer worried about what might happen next, or about where her music would take her. She realized that it didn't matter. She had already found what she had been looking for, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep creating, a way to connect. One evening, after the cafe had closed, she stayed behind alone. The lights were dim and the air was still. She sat at the piano, running her fingers softly over the keys. Her reflection looked back at her from the glossy surface, calm and content. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of silence, the first hesitant notes, the people who had come into her life because of music. Every moment, every struggle had led her to this quiet peace. She began to play one last song, slow and tender. It wasn't a song of sadness or loss, but of gratitude. Each note carried her story, not a story of perfection, but of courage, of learning to begin again. As the final note faded, she whispered softly into the empty room, "Thank you." It was a thank you to life, to music, to every person who had listened and believed. Outside, the city was calm. The moonlight spilled across the streets and the world seemed at rest. She stood, closed the piano gently, and walked to the window. The night breeze brushed against her face, cool and kind. She smiled, knowing deep in her heart that this was not the end. It was simply another beginning, one filled with music, kindness, and quiet strength. She knew she would keep playing, not for applause, not for recognition, but because it was who she was. The woman who once was told to play a simple tune had found her song. And now she would never stop. And somewhere in that peaceful silence, the faint sound of piano music drifted out into the night, carrying her story into hearts she would never meet, soft, gentle, and endlessly alive.